They said it was a joke, a meme, a headline designed to go viral and disappear. Buying Greenland, taking Greenland, as if the modern world still worked that way. But inside the rooms where decisions are actually made, no one was laughing. Because the truth is, this was never about humor, or ego, or real estate fantasies. It was about something far colder, far more calculated, a decision framed not as desire, but as necessity. When great powers start using that word necessity, history tells us something dangerous is happening. This story has been buried under punchlines and late-night monologues, but quietly, the language has changed. What once sounded absurd is now discussed as inevitable. What once looked optional now feels urgent, and what once seemed impossible is being planned for in spreadsheets, military briefings, and closed-door meetings. This isn't about a frozen island on the edge of the map. It's about trade routes that decide who gets rich and who gets cut off. Resources hidden under ice that power phones, weapons, and entire economies. And rivals who don't need to invade to take control, they just need time. When the ice melts, geography stops being neutral. When rivals move faster, restraint becomes risk. So before you dismiss this story again, ask yourself one question. What if the joke was always the cover story? For months, the idea lived in the safe place where serious things go to die. Late-night jokes, smirks from commentators, headlines framed as curiosity, not consequence. Buying Greenland became shorthand for excess. Another example of how disconnected power had become from reality, and in public, that framing worked perfectly. The laughter did its job, it lowered defenses, it told people this story wasn't worth following. But while the public was entertained, the machinery of state was doing something very different. Inside defense departments, trade ministries, and intelligence briefings, Greenland was never treated like a punchline. It was treated like a file, quietly updated, constantly referenced. Moved from the bottom of the agenda to the top without ever making a sound. That's how serious shifts always happen. Not with speeches, not with votes, but with language changes in rooms you never see. Notice how the words evolved. First it was floated as a purchase, then as an option, then as a strategic interest, and finally as a concern. Each step sounds small, each step feels reasonable, but together they tell a story of escalation hiding in plain sight. When journalists laughed, planners listened. When pundits mocked, analysts calculated. Because the people paid to think long-term don't care how an idea sounds today. They care how it looks 10 years from now, when rivals have moved and windows have closed. History is filled with moments that began as jokes until they weren't. And while everyone laughed, someone was already preparing. Empires like to tell themselves comforting stories. That they act out of principle. That expansion is ambition. That power is about choice. But history tells a colder truth. Empires don't move because they want more. They move because they're afraid of losing what they already have, afraid of being bypassed, afraid of waking up one morning to find that the world reorganized itself without their permission. This pattern repeats again and again. When trade routes shift, when resources change hands, when rivals learn to play the long game, expansion suddenly gets a new name. It's no longer called conquest. It's called defense. Not because it is defensive, but because calling it anything else would expose the panic underneath. Rome didn't push outward because it loved borders. Britain didn't dominate the seas out of curiosity. America didn't stretch coast to coast because it enjoyed empty land. Each move came at a moment when standing still felt more dangerous than moving forward. And this is the key to understanding Greenland. Not as an island, not as a territory, but as a response. When routes, resources, and rivals converge, hesitation becomes vulnerability. And in that moment, empires don't debate morality. They calculate survival. Empires don't ask if they should move only when. For most of human history, ice was protection. Frozen seas were walls. Polar regions were buffers. Nature itself enforced distance, delay, and caution. But that protection is disappearing. The Arctic is no longer a dead zone at the edge of the world. It's becoming a corridor, a shortcut, a multiplier. As temperatures rise, the ice that once blocked movement is thinning, retreating, cracking open pathways that did not exist on any map a generation ago. What used to take weeks of dangerous navigation is becoming routine. What once required permission from geography now only requires fuel. And when geography changes, strategy follows. Melting ice isn't just an environmental issue, it's a logistical revolution. New shipping lanes are forming where no lanes were possible before. Military access points are opening in places that were once unreachable. Resources locked beneath ice for thousands of years are becoming extractable, measurable, monetizable. The Arctic is turning from a moat into a highway. And highways don't just carry goods, they carry influence, control, power. Countries that once ignored the North are now racing to define it, because whoever sets the rules early doesn't just profit, they dictate the future terms of trade, security, and movement. When ice melts, maps are rewritten. And rewritten maps don't ask who's comfortable with the change. Greenland doesn't look powerful on a map. It's quiet, sparse, vast in a way that feels empty rather than important. But that perception is the trap. Because Greenland is not valuable for what happens on it, it's valuable for what moves around it. Think of it as a lock placed at the mouth of the North Atlantic, a bridge between hemispheres, a watchtower sitting above the world's fastest changing sea lanes. Aircraft flying between North America and Europe pass near it. Ships moving between Asia and the West increasingly must account for it. Missiles, satellites, submarines, all of them calculate Greenland into their paths. Control this island, and you don't just control land. You control timing. You control access. You control who sees what coming. This is why strategists don't talk about Greenland in emotional terms. They talk about it in diagrams, arcs, circles, lines showing reach and range. To some, it's just ice. To planners, it's leverage. And leverage doesn't need attention to matter. It only needs to exist. Some places don't look powerful until you need them. In 1867, the United States bought Alaska. At the time, it was treated exactly the way Greenland is treated now, as a mistake. A frozen wasteland, a vanity purchase. Newspapers mocked it relentlessly. Politicians called it foolish. The public laughed at the idea that anyone would spend money on land covered in ice and darkness. They even gave it a name, Seward's Folly. William H. Seward, the man who approved the deal, was accused of wasting taxpayer money on something useless. The logic of the purchase made no emotional sense in that moment. Alaska produced nothing. It connected to nothing. It looked like dead weight on the map. But Seward wasn't buying land for the present. He was buying position. Decades later, Alaska became a military keystone during World War II and the Cold War. It turned into America's northern shield, its listening post against rivals, and eventually one of its richest resource hubs. Oil, gas, minerals, fisheries all sitting on land everyone once laughed at. History didn't remember the jokes. It remembered the outcome. What looks ridiculous in one era often looks inevitable in the next. And when strategists talk about Greenland today, they aren't hearing laughter. They're remembering Alaska. History has a strange way of forgiving expensive decisions. The logic that justified Alaska never disappeared. It just went quiet. When World War II broke out, Greenland stopped being an afterthought and became a shield. Nazi Germany's occupation of Denmark created a vacuum, and vacuums in geopolitics don't stay empty for long. The United States moved quickly, not to own Greenland, but to prevent someone else from using it first. Airstrips were built, weather stations installed, radar placed where the curve of the Earth mattered. Greenland became an unsinkable outpost in a war where distance and warning time meant survival. Then the Cold War arrived, and the Arctic became the front line. The shortest path for bombers and missiles between the United States and the Soviet Union ran straight over the pole. Greenland sat directly beneath that arc. What had once been ice and silence turned into a listening post, an early warning system, a place where minutes could mean millions of lives. This wasn't ideology, it was geometry. Even after the Cold War ended, the infrastructure stayed, the mindset stayed, the quiet assumption that Greenland mattered more than it appeared stayed. Wars end, treaties are signed, headlines move on. But the logic of war positioning, access, reaction time never truly leaves. It just waits for the next moment when geography becomes relevant again. And that moment is arriving faster than anyone expected. What most people don't realize is that the shift wouldn't begin with soldiers landing on beaches, because they're already there. Quietly, steadily, for decades, the United States has maintained a military presence in Greenland that feels invisible precisely because it's normal. Radar installations, air bases, surveillance systems pointed not at the island itself, but at everything moving around it. No flags raised. No declarations made. Just protection. That slowly became permanence. From a distance, it looks like cooperation. Defense agreements, shared security, mutual interests. But from a strategic view, it's something else entirely. it's pre-positioning. The hard part of control isn't building from scratch. It's establishing the first footprint. And that footprint already exists. Aircraft already rely on Greenland for refueling and monitoring. Early warning systems already feed data southward. Command structures already treat the island as part of a larger defensive network. So, when planners imagine the future, they aren't picturing invasion. They're picturing continuity, a formalization of what's already operational, a change on paper that matches reality on the ground. You don't need to invade what you already protect. The question isn't how control would begin. It's how long it stays unofficial. On paper, Greenland looks independent. It has its own government, its own elections, its own identity. But paper sovereignty and real independence are not the same thing. Greenland's population is small, smaller than many towns. Its economy is fragile, exposed, and dependent on money that comes from somewhere else. Each year, subsidies arrive from Denmark to keep basic systems running: schools, hospitals, administration, infrastructure. Without that money, the system doesn't slow down, it stops. This is the sovereignty trap. You can govern yourself. You can vote. You can pass laws. But if your economy cannot survive on its own, your freedom is conditional. And conditions always come with leverage. This isn't corruption, it's arithmetic. When funding determines stability, whoever controls the funding shapes the future. Not through force, but through necessity. Promises start to matter more than principles. Survival reframes every political debate. To the outside world, Greenland appears free. To strategists, it appears vulnerable. Because the moment another power offers more investment, more security, more opportunity, loyalty becomes a question, not an assumption. Freedom is expensive, and someone always pays. China didn't arrive in the Arctic with warships. It arrived with proposals, infrastructure plans, investment packages, long-term financing that looked, at first glance, harmless. While Western attention was fixed elsewhere, China began describing itself with a new phrase, a near-Arctic stakeholder, not because geography allowed it, but because capital did. Beijing understood something fundamental. You don't need proximity to gain influence. You need patience and contracts. Airports were discussed. Ports were evaluated. Research stations appeared under the banner of science and cooperation. Each project, taken alone, seemed reasonable, even beneficial. But together, they formed a pattern planners recognized immediately. This wasn't occupation. It was insertion. Where soldiers raise alarms, investments raise dependencies. Loans don't demand loyalty up front. They demand it later, quietly, legally, when repayment comes due. For Greenland, these offers were tempting. Development without austerity, growth without delay, a chance to step out from dependency and into relevance. But for Washington, the math was terrifying. If critical infrastructure fell under Chinese financial control, decisions would follow. Airspace, ports, access. Influence would shift without a single shot fired. Empires don't always knock. They invest. Beneath the ice, Greenland hides something far more valuable than land. Not oil slicks or gold veins you can point to on a map, but materials so small most people never think about them. Rare earth elements, the invisible backbone of the modern world. Every smartphone vibration, every electric motor, every advanced missile guidance system, all of it depends on these materials. The problem isn't scarcity. The planet has rare earths in many places. The problem is control, processing, refinement. Today, an overwhelming share of that process runs through China. Not by accident, but by design. That means supply chains don't just flow through markets. They flow through political decisions. If exports slow, factories stall. If access is cut, entire industries freeze. From consumer electronics to fighter jets, dependency has become the pressure point. And this is where Greenland stops being theoretical. Geologists have identified massive untapped deposits beneath its surface among the largest known reserves on Earth. Enough to shift balances. Enough to break monopolies. Enough to terrify anyone who already controls the flow. This isn't about mining profits. It's about leverage. About whether future technology runs through one gatekeeper or several. The most powerful weapons don't look like weapons. They sit quietly inside the things you can't live without. Borders used to define power. Coastlines, checkpoints, choke points guarded by geography and force. But trade doesn't care about borders anymore. It cares about distance, time, and cost. And that is why the Arctic is rewriting the rules. As the ice retreats, New routes are opening across the top of the world, paths that cut thousands of miles off traditional shipping lanes, routes that bypass congested canals, unstable regions, and political bottlenecks that once dictated global commerce. What used to be a journey shaped by empires in the south is becoming a shortcut controlled by whoever dominates the north. For shipping companies, these routes mean fewer days at sea and millions saved on fuel. For nations, they mean leverage, toll-setting power, monitoring rights, the ability to speed allies forward or slow rivals down. This is where geography stops being academic. Control access, and you control timing. Control timing, and you control markets. Greenland sits at the eastern gate of these emerging pathways, not at the center of trade, but at the door. And doors matter more than destinations, because the future of trade doesn't ask who owned the past. It asks, who's standing in the way now? At first, the conversation sounded simple. Could the United States buy Greenland? Was there a price that would make the question go away? But over time, the language shifted, quietly, deliberately. Inside policy circles, the word purchase started to feel inadequate. Too optional, too polite. Buying implies consent, negotiation, the idea that both sides walk away unchanged. That's no longer how this is being discussed. Because waiting has consequences. Every year that passes, competitors move deeper into the region. More contracts signed, more infrastructure planned, more leverage quietly accumulated. The longer action is delayed, the higher the cost becomes, economically, politically, and eventually militarily. What could have been a transaction starts to look like exposure. From this perspective, buying Greenland isn't the goal. Securing it is, ensuring that no rival can dominate the access points, the resources, the routes that will define the next century. And once a decision is framed as security, timelines collapse. Options narrow. Risks escalate. Because hesitation no longer feels cautious. It feels dangerous. What happens when waiting becomes the most dangerous option? When force is too risky and patience is too slow, power looks for another way in. This is where pressure replaces permission. The strategy taking shape isn't dramatic. There are no tanks, no ultimatums, no red lines drawn in public. Instead, it follows a model that would look familiar in any corporate boardroom. You isolate the asset. You make the current arrangement expensive, and you present an alternative that feels irresistible. On one track, Greenland. Economic partnerships, direct aid, infrastructure investment framed not as charity, but as empowerment. A narrative that says independence doesn't have to mean isolation, that there is another partner ready to step in, write checks, build roads, open markets, and offer security without lectures. The message is subtle but powerful. You don't need to rely on Europe anymore. On the other track, Denmark. Quiet pressure, strategic conversations about defense responsibilities, suggestions that current investment levels are insufficient, warnings that threats in the Arctic are growing faster than small states can handle alone. It's a squeeze. If Denmark wants to keep Greenland, it must spend more to defend it, much more. If it doesn't, it risks being framed as negligent and ally, unable to secure its own territory. Either way, the status quo becomes uncomfortable, unsustainable, politically costly. This is how takeovers happen without signatures. There is another path, one no one likes to talk about openly. It begins the same way these things always do, with a threat. Not a declared one, but an implied one. Intelligence reports, security briefings, quiet leaks about dual-use facilities, hidden capabilities, or infrastructure that could be repurposed overnight. Suddenly, what looked like economic competition is reframed as an emergency. And emergencies change the rules. In moments like these, legality bends toward urgency. Alliances are reinterpreted. Old precedents are dusted off and presented as justification. The argument becomes simple and brutally effective. If a territory cannot protect itself from hostile influence, someone else must step in. We've seen this movie before. During World War II, when Denmark fell under Nazi occupation, the United States moved into Greenland without asking permission. The justification was protection, prevention. The belief that waiting would be more dangerous than acting. Once that logic is accepted, timelines collapse. Security overrides consultation. Prevention overrides consent. Power moves first, explanations come later. No one announces annexation. No one needs to. Control arrives under the language of necessity, temporary at first, then normalized, then permanent. Emergency powers always sound reasonable at the beginning. The only question is how long the emergency lasts. This is the part that often gets overlooked. Why this idea doesn't just survive politically, but resonates. Because for many Americans, this isn't about maps or minerals. It's about a feeling that's been building for years that the country is falling behind. That manufacturing left. That influence slipped. That rivals learned how to play the system better. In that emotional landscape, Greenland becomes more than territory. It becomes proof. Proof that decline isn't inevitable. Proof that power can still act decisively. Proof that the story isn't over. Expansion has always sold well when people feel anxious about the future, not because they want dominance, but because they want reassurance. They want something tangible, something you can point to and say, we're still in control. Greenland offers that symbolism, a visible move, a clear shift, a reminder that strength doesn't always announce itself loudly, sometimes it simply redraws the edge of the map. It's not about conquest in the old sense. It's about momentum, about convincing a nervous public that the country can still shape outcomes instead of reacting to them. People don't crave dominance. They crave reassurance. There is a moment in every empire's story when delay stops being neutral. Up to that point, waiting feels prudent, careful, responsible, but then something shifts. Costs rise, options shrink, rivals entrench themselves deeper. What once looked like patience starts to look like negligence. This is that moment. Every year, the Arctic becomes more accessible. Every season, new investments lock in long-term influence. Infrastructure hardens, relationships solidify, dependencies form, and with each step, reversing course becomes harder, more expensive, more dangerous. Strategists call this the closing window. Miss it, and the choices left on the table are worse. Act later, and confrontation becomes unavoidable. Act now, and it's a crisis but a manageable one. This is the brutal arithmetic that dominates internal discussions. Not ideology, not morality, timing. Because power rarely collapses in dramatic defeat. It erodes, slowly, quietly, one deferred decision at a time. When planners look at Greenland today, they don't see a bold opportunity. They see a ticking clock, a narrowing set of outcomes, a future where hesitation writes checks that force will later have to cash. Every empire has a moment it can't rewind. And this feels like one of them. Strip away the personalities, the headlines, the outrage cycles. What remains is not a scandal, or a scheme, or a single leader's obsession. It's a collision of forces that don't care who's in office. Climate change opening routes that can't be closed again. Resources becoming more critical as technology accelerates. Great powers competing in spaces that used to be unreachable. Greenland sits where all of this converges. This is why the question won't go away. Not next year. Not after an election. Not after a denial or a reassurance. Because the pressure isn't political. It's structural. When ice melts, access expands. When access expands, competition follows. And when competition reaches critical infrastructure and irreplaceable resources, neutrality disappears. Borders have always changed this way, not with grand announcements, but with slow normalization. First presence, then protection, then justification. Finally, permanence. Each step explainable. Each step defensible. Each step harder to reverse than the last. In the future, people may argue about who wanted this or who allowed it, but history will record something simpler, that once the conditions were in place, the outcome was predictable. Maps don't change quietly. They change while everyone is arguing about something else. This was never a joke, and it was never random. What looked like an outrageous headline was actually a signal, a glimpse of the logic operating beneath the noise. The kind of logic that doesn't care about optics, only outcomes. That measures success in access, leverage, and time. Greenland isn't about ego. It isn't about one leader or one moment. It's about how power behaves when it feels boxed in. When trade routes shift, when resources concentrate, when rivals move faster than expected. This is how borders have always changed. Not overnight, not with applause, but through decisions framed as unavoidable. If you want to understand the future, you have to stop watching the jokes and start watching the incentives, the money, the routes, the pressure points no one campaigns on. Because long after the headlines fade, those forces keep moving. And when the map finally changes, most people will act surprised even though the logic was visible all along. If you want more deep dives like this, stories that follow power, money, and history instead of noise, consider subscribing. Stay curious. Because understanding power doesn't make you cynical. It makes you prepared.